Welcome to Seatton Education. I'm Victoria. Once again, we're diving into the world of home education to show that homeschooling really can be an achievable educational option. Today, I'm speaking with husband and wife team David and Sandra Snoke from the United States. David is Distinguished Professor of Physics at the University of Pittsburgh and co-director of the Pittsburgh Quantum Institute. He is also an ordained elder in the Presbyterian Church. Sandra was for many years the director of women's discipleship at a large church in Pittsburgh. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. They began homeschooling in the 1980s and graduated their youngest child in 2009. David and Sandy, hello. Thanks for being with me. Can you start by telling us why you decided to go this route? Why did you decide to home educate?
Okay, well, we actually lived in Illinois for several years while I was doing my PhD work there. And we happened to be in a church that had several homeschoolers. And I just remember having a lot of conversations with them. And there was a few things that kind of stood out in our minds. Probably the first one was just the people we met and their homeschooled kids seemed to be really well balanced and really interact with adults well. And so that got us intrigued and curious. Um, They actually had an informational session at one point, where they had some school teachers and some homeschoolers together, sort of like a panel discussion, that we attended. And, one of the things that really struck me at the time was that 3 of the 4 school teachers that were on the panel said that they had been explicitly taught in their education to become teachers, that one of the goals was to pry loose the allegiance of the kids from their parents and to transfer it to the teachers in the school. And that actually resonated with me because I remember as a kid, um, if my teacher said something, it was definitely true, and if my parents said something, it might or might not be true. Uh, and I never thought about why that was, but actually that was the culture that was being created, of sort of a transfer of authority or of credibility, and so that got me thinking. And then the other thing I guess I would say, so neither of us was homeschooled ourselves. We went through the normal public school system, and, uh, very different experiences in a lot of ways, but, in my experience, there was 2 things that really stood out in my memory. One was that it was a constant bullying of people, one against another, a pecking order. And the other was just a continual sexual bombardment, that jokes were being made, sexual harassment continuously going on. And, my first bias was, well, that's what I went through. If I went through it, my kids can go through it.
Mm.
And then I thought, it actually isn't necessary for everybody to have to go through that.
Mm.
If they're homeschooled, they don't have to be bullied all the time. And so that got us started on it. But I would say, even with that, we said, well, let's do this provisionally. Let's just try it and see what happens. And then Sandy, actually, you can jump in.
Yeah.
She's the one who actually started doing it.
Well, the other thing that really caught my attention was the family dynamic that I saw within the context of these homeschooling families. And I remember one day after church having a conversation with one of the young elementary school children who was homeschooled. And she just very naturally flowed from interacting with me to playing with my toddler. And I just thought, there's something really special here in the way that she is communicating and feels very comfortable talking with across the board with different age
Hmm.
groups. And so, really, I knew nothing about their academic abilities, but what I really was caught by was their social
Mhm.
ability, their interactions.
Yeah, one of the things which is intrinsic to any typical school, even a very good school, is horizontal relationships. That you're pretty
Mm.
much in an environment where everyone is the same age as you.
Mhm.
And actually, historically, most people have not grown up that way, right? Most people interact
Mm.
with many different generations. And so um, we can often tell, even meeting people now who are teenagers, what kind of school they've gone to, because if
Mm.
they're very awkward and uncomfortable talking to an adult, it's often because they have no experience with it because they spend all of their
Mm.
time talking only to people
Mm.
exactly their own age.
And I think this is a problem. Sorry, Sandy, to interject. I was reading an article the other day that was talking about a concept they called perpetual adolescence. And this is women and men in their 30s who don't want to get married, don't want to have kids, feel very, very ill at ease in environments where they're not in a big gang of 10 other chaps their own age. And increasingly that's difficult because people have lives and have commitments and move on. And the reality is, it's A, not very healthy, and B, not very accessible to have a big gang of guys that you go around with when you're 45. and actually, I think our school system prepares you for that. So to put people through a system and expect them to come out as completely different people is almost a bit of madness, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that, I mean, in my experience, I mentioned some things that were very bad. But there's also things you could say are intrinsic, even in a very good school. And that horizontal relationship thing, I would call sort of an unnatural way of raising anybody, really.
Mm. And Sandy, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, I had a lot of relatives who were public educators. And so we started homeschooling, late 80s, early 90s. There was a lot of skepticism as to what we were doing. And, but we went to a family gathering when my youngest was probably about 3 years old. And I was off doing something else. He was sitting in a room with a group of adults watching a golf game. And I came into the room and I started to be questioned about our homeschooling. And at one point, the educator just stopped and said, "Yes, I understand. You're very socialized. Your children are fine." He said, "I'm sitting here with your 3-year-old who is going on 13."
That is interesting. I had a similar situation when one of our sons was young, and we went for a set of vaccinations at the doctor's, and the nurse said, asked him all these questions, and he was very chatty back, and she said to me, "Oh wow, where does he go to preschool?" And I said, "Oh, well, he doesn't actually go to preschool." And immediately she'd gone from saying how wonderful and outgoing he was to, school is really important for children. And I thought, you've just told me I should call his preschool teachers and say what a wonderful job they're doing. And now I've admitted that I'm the preschool teacher. It's suddenly
It's
really
not okay.
not the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Sandy, it was you who was doing most of the home educating. Is that right? You were home with your 4
Well,
children.
I would say it was mostly me in the very early years, but David was very involved middle school on.
So you split that teaching in a kind of age level, that you did a lot more of the elementary stuff, and then you split it more as the children got older. And how did you balance your other commitments, whether that was career or other involvements, around homeschooling your kids?
Well, for myself, it became my priority. So, it was an adjustment. I always tell moms who are considering it, don't do this unless you really want to, because it will become your priority. I mean, you are it. If you are not educating your children, they won't be educated. And I think it's a really important point for women or men to think through. But yeah, I would say, there was a learning curve with really, setting aside other things till later. But, it was worth it.
Yeah, so there was, I mean, to some degree, having Sandy stay home and do the teaching, there was sort of life decisions about like living more simply, right? And we don't need to have a really large income. At the same time, there are hidden costs to working outside the home, like needing a second car, eating out more often, paying for childcare, and so on. So we did make decisions to live more simply, but it wasn't as big a hit as you might think, given that there are hidden expenses to working as well.
I think that's a good point to make. And as it comes back to what you were saying, Sandy, about you need to work out what your priorities are in life. Obviously, for some people, it will always be inaccessible to live on one income. But I think for a lot of people, it might mean you don't take the holidays,
Hmm.
or you don't have the second car, or you don't eat out once a week, or whatever the
Hmm.
thing might be that is the thing that someone might consider part of the normal life, that then when you reassess what your priorities are,
Hmm.
sometimes those things are luxuries and they come off the
Right.
table.
It also, your children might not be involved in as many extracurricular activities that cost money. Like, even
Mhm.
your children, it's like teaching them a little bit of a simpler lifestyle as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, at the same
And
time,
also,
the fact that she wasn't working for money doesn't mean she wasn't doing anything outside the home. She actually was volunteering to help in leadership with a number of nonprofit type organizations. So,
yeah,
uh,
interesting.
I actually think it's healthy for anybody to, not literally live within the confines of four walls, right? And to get out. So she was actually doing a lot of administrative organizing stuff and not being paid for it. And again, I think that we don't have to make that equation, that you can only do
Yes.
stuff that is important if you get paid for it.
Completely agree. I mean, I think it is actually worth making that point. But I think that is. I mean, I've never yet met a homeschooling mother, certainly that I've interviewed, who hasn't been. I think by dint of the kind of thing you're doing, you tend to be really open-minded and just and also
Yeah.
active, and so you do get drawn into other
Right.
activities. But no, I think that is interesting to hear, how you balanced that between you as well. I wanted to ask, I know that you were involved with a co-op. Now, maybe in other parts, that's obviously very established, that idea of homeschool co-ops in the States. In other countries, that might not be familiar to listeners. We have viewers from around the world. So can you just explain what that looked like and how you got involved with that?
Sure. So we actually lived in California for a while before moving to Pennsylvania. Um, and so in both co-ops, it's very parent directed and parent led in terms of, if a parent has an expertise or an interest in a certain subject or even just an extracurricular type activity, then the parent was the one who would be leading it. And typically you would meet maybe twice a week, once a month. I would say at that time, our co-op was less central to our homeschooling curriculum as to how I would say a lot of co-ops are organized uh, presently, which some of the present co-ops, you actually do a lot of your core work
Mm.
twice a week at a co-op, and then, you're working at home 3 days a week on your assignments.
Yeah, some of them now, it's been an interesting evolution because I would say, when we were doing this primarily in the 90s when they were younger, uh, there was pretty much you got together for special topics classes. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Somebody was doing something on theater or somebody was doing something on, physics or something. Uh, Now I see a lot more of people getting together where there's a curriculum sort of given to you by the co-op. They choose it at the beginning of the
Okay.
year, and then everybody's working through the same materials together. And I think that has a big advantage for people who aren't really confident that they're going to teach the right thing. Probably the biggest barrier to homeschooling is people not feeling confident that they would teach the right stuff. And so
Mm.
that kind of co-op has been growing in popularity, especially with people who are, doing it for the first time and not sure what it's going to really look like.
So the co-op that a friend and I started, we called it a writers club. And the goal was for the children to become comfortable with writing something simple, standing up, and sharing it to a group of people.
Mm.
So, we were trying to help them in terms of creative writing, but also to really begin to be comfortable with public speaking in a very simple way that we were hoping would
Mm-hmm.
really follow through, the rest of their academic career.
Mm. I think you picked up on the point of confidence there, both for the children and for the
Hmm.
parents. And it just made me think about a point that you made earlier, Sandy, about mothers or fathers not knowing when they start homeschooling, or when they're considering whatever the educational options are for their children, not knowing if it's for them. You said, you should only do this if you really want to do it. What are the things that you think parents should be considering to work out whether this is a route that they might go down?
So I think the commitment is really when I was saying you need to decide whether this is something you really want to do. You have to see it as I am committing my time and my energies to this process of homeschooling, because you can't, it. And when I talk about it being your priority, it can't be like I'm going to do these things and I'm going to homeschool. It really needs to be I'm going to go homeschool and I will have these other areas of my life that, are avenues. And I mean, so I have a high school education, so I'm not educated as a educator. My first curriculum, um, uh, it was 1989. Um, it turned out to be a curriculum that was eclectic. They had just gathered, workbooks and readers from different curriculums. There were no instructions. I just opened this box and laid all these books out on the floor, and I remember
It was like
thinking,
introductory Greek for kindergartners.
I
You know,
yeah,
it
yeah,
was so ridiculously hard.
yeah, but I just remember thinking, "No clue what I'm doing." Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna swim. I'm not gonna sink,
Yeah.
because I'm really committed to this. I want to be with my children. I want to have this time with them, and I figured it out. So that's what I mean by the commitment, because there are going to be days you're going to question, what am I doing?
Mm.
Yeah.
And is this working? Is this not working? But I think if you have that commitment, you'll make it work. You'll figure it out.
Now, I would just add, actually, I think um, a lot of parents, also in other educational styles, stress enormously about how much their kid is learning. And we found after, 4 kids and experimenting that in the first couple of years, if the only thing they learn is that education is a good thing and that sitting down and not playing is an okay thing to do,
Mhm.
like you're that's fine.
Mm.
Little kids' brains are wired differently, and not every kid is gonna be ready to sit down and, do all kinds of stuff before age 7 or 8,
Mhm.
and so
Mm.
learning to adapt to the kid and say, like, just create a love of learning
Mhm.
even more than any particular material. When we started out, I think like a lot of parents in other schooling, it was so stressed of like, "Oh, my kid is already behind because they don't know this or that or the other thing." And
Mhm.
actually, you can be way more relaxed because,
Mhm.
by the time they're, 9 or 10, if they love learning, they're gonna pick up books and read them on their own,
Mm.
and they're gonna, just zoom ahead suddenly, but if they start to hate learning, then that's gonna stick with them,
Yeah.
and so you just wanna, in some sense, not stress out over getting through a certain amount of material.
Mhm.
Now, the other
There's
thing I would just say is that part of the fun of it is that you can actually combine lots of other activities with homeschooling. And so it's kind of a joke
Mm.
within the homeschooling community that like you go shopping and like, well, that's math class because we're adding up the sales, and then, well, that's also like science because we're reading ingredients and we're learning about like
Mm.
fractions of things that are ingredients. And so it's like
Mm.
you actually can multitask a lot of times in
Yeah.
these things.
A- And I think the big thing there, the latent thought behind what you're saying there is what you have as homeschooling parents is you have time that isn't available in other
Mhm.
settings. So actually, if you're not rushing to the grocery store because you've just picked up kid number 1 and 2 and you've got to go and get kid number 3 from swimming, and so you've just got to get through that grocery store as quickly as possible, that is not a maths lesson.
Yeah.
But if you're able to take an hour and a half and you say, okay, so how if we bought these and these, how much together? And I think so much of mainstream life is forcing families to live in the fast lane all the time, and that can be absolutely exhausting. And then I think people who live like that say, oh, I could never homeschool because I don't know how I would
Because it
fit
sounds
it
like you're
into this
adding
life
it to
that
the other. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I used to have to remind myself, you're not in a classroom situation, so don't try to recreate a classroom. But also that even within the context of a classroom, you have all sorts of disruptions and things don't
Yeah.
happen, they don't get done. And so, in the homeschool, you also have disruptions, but it's okay, right? A child gets sick, you have to go visit the doctor that day instead of sticking to whatever the daily schedule was. It's okay. It doesn't all have to happen in one day. And even if you think about learning, it's a continual building process. So sometimes I think we would put pressure on ourselves that they have to learn everything in 1 year. And that's not possible, right? It's a continual building process. Every year, you just continue to keep building on the blocks that have been established. And I think that's an important point to remember, not to put too much pressure, for the parent not to put too much pressure on themselves.
I think it's easy to listen to that, but actually quite difficult to take it on
Yes,
board.
it is.
I've done so much research. I've read so many academic papers on the outcomes of homeschooling, and I know that data, but equally it is so hard not to have a goal for your child and think, well, why haven't they got it today?
Yeah.
And to actually listen to that and say, it's okay, we'll try again tomorrow, is very difficult because that's not how we who have gone through the traditional school system
Yeah, well, you're talking about
are brought
you're
up.
talking about studies, but one of the things that back in the 80s that kind of got me again thinking down these lines was that most studies showed that like smaller class size is better, all the way down to 1. Individual tutoring is better than a group of 5. And part of that is because of individual tailoring. Like you can look at that kid and say, what is this kid ready for right now? As opposed to saying I have to treat 10 or 20 kids with a broad brush and teach them all the same thing. And so part of that is when you say, my kid is just not good at this particular thing, and that's okay. And I can give them some more time. And again, not stressing about they've got to be a genius in everything,
Yes. And actually, it's a good point. And I say this to someone who clearly is a genius in physics. Actually, people who are really good at one area often aren't good in another area. There is something that, whereas I think in the school system, it doesn't necessarily represent that. I remember in my school, we were streamed, but you were streamed academically rather than per subject. So if you were in set 1 for maths, you were also in set 1 for English. And I remember knowing some girls who were, really, really good at maths, who were really, really bad at English.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so I think that's a good point. You also we talked earlier about historically what has happened and these idea of multi-generational settings. Something that struck me this week, I was with my family, we went to an exhibition on the Grand Tour when these sort of aristocratic young men, often in the 17 and 1800s, would travel around Europe for sometimes 5 years from the ages of sort of 15 to 25 at some period in there, and they'd learn and they'd take on culture and they'd learn about the new scientific inventions. And what really struck me is, obviously that was the elite, that was the aristocracy, and those people didn't go to schools. Those people all had private tutors. So I thought that was interesting that when we think now about even these really, elite schools in Britain, for example, they were always for the working class children, the ones that have now become very expensive, whose parents didn't have another option. And so they were put into these mass school environments. The parents who did have a choice and who wanted their children to have the best
All did
possible well-rounded
homeschooling.
education had
Yep.
tutors.
Yeah.
and
Yeah, actually,
they had one-on-one tuition.
connecting to the grand tour thing, actually, another thing that was something fun that Sandy did quite a bit was take them to museums and
Yeah.
also to concerts. We took them to the symphony and so on.
Mm.
And but museums, especially, you can take your time. Instead of
Yes.
being on like a guided tour, where you have a 1 hour field trip from school or something,
Mm.
they could take a day and just go through a
Yeah.
museum slowly, have lunch there, and actually talk about what do you think about that thing that we're looking
Yeah.
at.
Mm. I know. I think it's fantastic. You touched earlier on the curriculums that you tried out. What did you settle on in terms of an approach or a style? Did you use different curricula each year? Did you devise your own? How did that look like once you got into the flow
We
of it?
pretty much devised our own.
Yeah.
So I think, especially in that first curriculum, it had so much material. And so I started kindergarten in Illinois, and then actually we moved to Germany right
Okay.
after that. And I think within the German school system, I really saw how the emphasis was on reading. Our oldest went to first and second grade there. Um, Homeschooling was not legal, and we were on the German
Yes.
economy, so we did as the Germans. But I saw that learning to read and write and math skills were really the core, and a lot of the other extracurricular subjects were not really emphasized. And
Mm.
I think we really took that to heart and saw that,
Mm.
until you really can read and understand math.
Well, we were also influenced by some Russian families. There was Russian scientists there who were
Yeah.
like, just do math and reading,
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, so I would say we pulled from different
Yeah.
curricula.
Mm.
Maybe not surprising, I didn't think any of the sort of standard curricula were doing a good job of science and math, for various reasons. But actually, one of the things that to me was a huge upside was when they were, starting in like 7th, 8th grade and so on up through high school. At that point, it almost wouldn't make sense to talk about a curriculum because at that point, they were
Mm.
self-learners, and so we basically just assigned books, and we said, sort of a great books approach of like, "Here are the
Yes.
50 or 60 books you need to read this year," And so, we joked about it like, I'd be leaving in the, dead of winter, going out into the cold Pittsburgh wind, and my teenage, high schoolers would be sitting curled up on the couch reading, Dostoevsky, and I'm like, "You don't know how good you have it."
Yes. But we can learn so much from reading. I mean, there's so many shocking statistics about how reading is declining, both
Mhm.
in terms of ability and also in terms of doing it, action, in young people. And I firmly believe that there is so much great stuff written out there that you can learn from without as well being wading through turgid textbooks that teach you. I remember when I was 15, the government introduced a set of I don't know what they're called, but basically fake fiction books to push certain values that the government deemed were important at that time. And they'd obviously be different values from now, which is in itself interesting because they haven't stood the test of time. That's only, 20 years ago, 400 years ago. And I just remember thinking how even as a 15-year-old, I knew that they were sort of make-believe just to push ideas, and the story was loosely hung on these. And then you'd turn to something like Jane Austen and you'd have wit and social observation and painful moments where you so got behind the characters. And I thought, wow, why don't they just set us to read Persuasion or
Yeah.
Mansfield
Well,
Park?
and also when reading this book, you're learning history,
Mhm.
right? You're
Yes,
understanding a
exactly.
time period. It's not just facts
Mm.
and
Yeah.
boring statistics, but you're actually understanding a time period.
Yeah, and I think you make an excellent point there. We've touched on the Grand Tour and we've talked about, reading these great books. the idea of the Renaissance man or woman doesn't exist so much. Certainly not in school systems now. But, Leonardo da Vinci, he wasn't just a scientist or just an artist. And I think historically people wouldn't have seen that division. If you were educated and curious, there was no reason why you couldn't apply what you'd learnt through looking at some aspect of flight, for example, and then use that in a creative setting or in a exploratory setting. And I think that is something I've seen with homeschooled children, how broad-minded they are, and therefore how they end up making often quite interesting connections between areas that they've studied, because it wasn't just they did maths or they did science or they did history, because they've been learning more holistically.
We, I would say, wanted to create in them a sense of curiosity and a sense of wonder and being interested in things. Our oldest ended up being a history major. Then the next was became a musician. The third, a theater major. Well, English and theater, I guess. And then the last one became a math major. So at least there's some math in there.
Close enough.
But yeah, I would say each in their respective fields is doing very well.
Lastly, I suppose I want to ask how homeschooling has impacted you as a family and you as a couple. You're the first couple that I've spoken to together. And I'm really curious to see how it impacted on your relationship and your family relationships.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that our kids are really best friends.
With each other.
With each other. Yeah, they're very, very close.
And again, when you think about horizontal relationships, that's often not the case, where like a older kid feels only connected to other older kids and can already turn away from their younger siblings, or vice versa, at an early age, and then they never mend those relationships. So yeah, I say we're friends with them and they're friends with us. That's the major thing.
Yeah.
I actually kind of connects to something we were talking about before in terms of educational style. Besides just sort of assigning them things, we engaged in a lot of what you might call Socratic dialogue, of just like asking them questions. That actually, anybody who's parenting can do that at the end of the day and say, what did you learn today? What'd you think about that? Like processing and talking about things instead of just memorizing them. So I would actually advocate that any educational style, every parent should be engaged in that education. And even if you're not homeschooling, you should be having those conversations and saying, what did you talk about today? And, what was interesting, what was boring, and so on. But yeah, I would say we have a sort of a family culture of asking questions. The kids used to joke about how I put them in, as I was tucking them into bed, I would say things like, well, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? And then they couldn't sleep for like the next, half hour. But, just that kind of like, getting people thinking and talking about things.
Yes.
I think the other aspect too, and thinking about this question, is I feel like we lived life together. In that terms of living life together, I taught them more than, academic prowess, but I taught them how to interact with a culture, how to really care about people and serve them. And so in living life together, we did that as a family.
Actually, it's sort of a homeschooling mentality to incorporate your kids alongside you in the things you're doing.
Oh, well, listen, thank you both so much for fitting this into your busy schedules.
Yeah, well, great talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us.
And thank you so much for joining Seatton Education today. I would be so grateful if you would consider leaving a comment or hitting subscribe, as it really does help other families find the show. Also, do go to seatton.com and you can put in your email address so that we can connect. See you next time.